Sometimes the home guards took the initiative, squeezing and mutilating women's breasts with pliers, pushing vermin and rifles into their vaginas, and forcing them to run naked around the inside of the post while carrying buckets of excrement on their heads. The women were also grabbed, oftentimes repeatedly by several men. Resistance could lead to summary execution or further torture before reconsideration of a life or death judgment. 𝗨𝗡𝗢𝗧𝗢𝗥𝗬𝗧, one of the few men left in 𝗨𝗧𝗢𝗥𝗬𝗧 district's 𝗕𝗥𝗜𝗧𝗢𝗥𝗬𝗧 village, later recalled the screams that would come from the home guard post. He had a unique vantage point, having been screened as white and serving as the teacher for the local loyalist children. But Simon was, by all accounts, a 𝗨𝗧𝗢𝗢𝗥𝗬𝗧 supporter even if he could do nothing to help those being tortured other than drop food into the 𝗕𝗥𝗜𝗧𝗢𝗥𝗬𝗧 when he found the opportunity. Otherwise, he later said, he tried not to watch the public displays of brutality no matter how difficult they were to avoid. I remember in our village there was a headman who had come from 𝗕𝗥𝗬𝗧𝗢𝗥𝗬𝗧. He was a very cruel man. Whenever that headman desired a woman, and she refused him, he would take a beer bottle, then order an 𝗨𝗧𝗢𝗥𝗬𝗧 to hold one of the woman's legs, and another to hold the other, wide apart. Then he would insert the bottle into the woman's private parts and punch it up to the stomach. Many women died after having been treated that way. First he beat them with sticks and kicks, but if they still resisted his advances he used the beer bottle. Nobody cared about them. The village men would be told to go and bury them in the village when they died. So many people died. I remember a few years ago a farmer who was digging in his 𝗕𝗥𝗬𝗧𝗢𝗥𝗬𝗧 farm exhumed a human skull into which a sweet potato had grown. The skull was taken to the local school for the young children to see how people had been buried. The area around where the skull was found had been the village graveyard, and if you tried digging there you would unearth skeletons of the people who were buried at that time. Nobody cared about the village people. The home guards were following the example of those in charge, but they also had choices, albeit those that were incredibly constrained by their bosses in the colonial government. They could have chosen not to graft, beat, and torture, but if they had, it could have meant running the risk of being labelled 𝗨𝗧𝗢𝗢𝗡, and thus on the receiving end of British colonial justice. Men like 𝗨𝗡𝗢𝗧𝗢𝗥𝗬𝗧 towed a very dangerous line and were, in fact, beaten by local district officers for not reporting 𝗨𝗧𝗢𝗢𝗡 activities. When double agents like Simon were caught, they were relieved of their duties and sent to the pipeline or summarily executed as an example to the rest. Other home guards were ordered by their white commanding officers to beat and torture the local villagers, and failure to comply would mean a beating identical to that which they could not bring themselves to administer. In the face of this pressure, and considering the rewards that accompanied compliance, it is easy to understand why many loyalists were willing participants in the torture of villagers, demonstrating their active support for the colonial government. The handful of former home guards who offered their recollections of the emergency invariably used language similar to that of colonial officials and local settlers. In their words, 𝗨𝗧𝗢𝗢𝗏 adherents were scum, filthy pigs, and savage animals who had to be wiped out. How much this eliminationist mentality was the result of intense exposure to British colonial discourse and how much was independently conceived by the loyalists themselves we will never know for certain. Today, many former 𝗨𝗧𝗢𝗢𝗡 share the sentiment of 𝗦𝗧𝗢𝗢𝗥𝗬𝗓, who lived in the North Tetu division of 𝗨𝗧𝗢𝗢𝗢𝗡 district during the emergency. The home guards behaved with such hatred and cruelty because they were being paid by the government to do it, she explained. They had agreed to become sellouts of their people, and the government was rewarding them for it. They had put money and personal gain before everything else. That coupled with the fact that they did not believe that Kenya would ever be free, that we would ever be independent. So they thought they chose the winner's side by supporting the colonialists. The behavior of the home guards cannot be analyzed without understanding the origins of their training and their inculcation into the philosophy and procedures of the British security forces. The women detained in the villages called Britain's security forces 𝗕𝗥𝗬𝗧𝗢𝗥𝗬𝗓, the fast ones, because of the speed with which they could inflict damage on the local population. Whenever those groups came into the villages, recalled 𝗨𝗡𝗢𝗢𝗢𝗏, they would wreak havoc within no time. They would be everywhere within a short period, turning houses inside out, burning houses, and raping women. It was so fast that a person in one house would have no time to know what was happening in another. As soon as she heard the screams, they had already burst into her house and began tearing it apart. Some women like 𝗨𝗡𝗢𝗢𝗢𝗏 distinguished between the British soldiers who were members of the military and paramilitary units, and the whites who belonged to the Kenya Police Reserve, the King's African Rifles, and the Kenya Regiment. Others simply referred to all of these men as Johnnies, or, in the words of several women, British savages. Women suspected of continuing to feed the 𝗨𝗡𝗨. Guerrillas were sometimes brought into the village square and shot or hung as an example to the rest. Sometimes they were beaten first with clubs and rifle butts, and sometimes grabbed. On other occasions, members of the security forces would take captured 𝗨𝗨 fighters, rope them to the back of Land Rovers, and drive them around the villages, leaving bits of body parts in their wake. Young children were slaughtered and their remains skewered on spears and paraded around the village squares by the home guards. Excrement-based torture was also widespread. The Johnnies would make us run around with toilet buckets on our heads, recalled one woman. The contents would be running down our faces, and we would have to wipe it off and eat it, or else we were shot. Even then, some people were killed anyway. There were also public executions of captured forest fighters, like this one described by 𝗕𝗥𝗬𝗧𝗢𝗥𝗬𝗧, who was a teenager at the time. When we were still living in home village, the British soldiers shot dead a man named Stefano and another. Many of these soldiers came, and the villagers were herded out into the square. And soon there were British soldiers everywhere. I do not know whether two 𝗨𝗨 fighters had been caught, but they were tied with ropes and hung onto a tree branch and then shot one after the other, in full view of all the villagers. That day, all of the remaining men were rounded up and taken to 𝗨𝗨𝗟, and only the women were left behind. The soldiers grabbed many of us. It did not matter whether they were young or old, all women in the villages lived in fear of sexual abuse. Some, like Milka, connived to avoid the fate of so many other women. The white officers had no shame. They would grab women in full view of everyone. They would take whomever they wanted at one corner and just do it right there. Whenever those soldiers came into the village, I remember I used to sneak into our house and smear ashes all over my body so they would not fancy me. Then, when they saw me, they would say, "Now look at this one, what is wrong with her?" Many women were not so fortunate. Mothers and daughters were sometimes grabbed together in the same hut by white and black members of the security forces. At gunpoint, others were given the choice between death and grape. Margaret Nyaruai explained why many chose grape. "We felt that we would rather allow them to grape us than get killed, especially those who had small children depending on them." Some women were attacked on their way to or from forced communal labor, others while they worked. "We would be digging the trench," recalled one woman, "being whipped if we worked too slowly or looked lethargic. And then a security force patrol would come by and just start dragging women into the forests and graping them. Then when they were finished with us, we had to go back to work, and if we didn't fill our quotas we would be beaten some more or sent to the home guard post, where we would be beaten and graped again." Oftentimes the security forces were demanding intelligence at the same time they were brutalizing the women. If the 𝗨𝗨 guerrillas had launched a successful attack, the Johnnies would often exact their revenge on the villagers while simultaneously interrogating them. They would sometimes squeeze women's breasts with pliers, recalled in 𝗕𝗥𝗬𝗧𝗢𝗥𝗬𝗓, or swing women by their long hair. Other times, one would be interrogated while lying on the ground, with a soldier stepping on her neck, while others would beat her all over her body. Then one would be allowed to sit upright and tell everything. If she still refused, she would be beaten again. Many died this way.